This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and Surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. Most Alamo enthusiasts know the Alamo Church did not have a roof during the 1836 battle. What's lesser known is why. Today we reveal the love triangle that changed the course of Alamo history, the crime of passion that led to a master stonemason fleeing town, and the aftermath that left the fated church unfinished. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. Today we're joined by Kolby Lanham, the Alamo senior researcher and historian. Thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here. We have a good one today.
We do. And when people come to the Alamo today, they see a church that looks, to the modern eye, complete. But that's not the whole story, is it?
Yeah, as Paul Harvey used to say, here's the rest of the story. So there's always something that goes on behind the scenes, and the Alamo has tons of those stories. But this one pertaining to the roof is very interesting.
It all really hinges on events that took place in August 1744, involving three people in a love triangle. Let's name the players, starting with Antonio Teo, a master mason from Zacatecas, Mexico.
He comes to San Antonio, and he's being brought in to work on all 5 Spanish missions, and there's even some indication that he may have been working on San Fernando as well. We don't know for sure he was born in Zacatecas, but the evidence points toward that, and when he comes to Texas, he's about 31 years old, which means he's born around 1713. He's going to be brought in to design the 4 churches, including the Alamo, and then over the next 4 years, he'll begin work on them. He lays the cornerstone for the Alamo Church on May 8th of 1744.
As you said, he works on the Alamo Church, which would have then been known as the Church at Mission San Antonio de Valero. Where can we still see his handiwork?
Yeah, if you go to any of the missions, you can see where he had designed those missions there, and those designs were later put into place. And then the Alamo today, the overall design was being built off of his ideas. So what you see today is kind of the ideas, the brainchild of this Antonio Teo.
The church that we see today, is that exactly where they would have built it back in the 1740s?
No. So my understanding is that they start building on this church. They get about hip high. They try to build the church up. It collapses. They bring in the new mason. They step back and they build the church on the current spot, but they used his plans to do so.
Theo is accused of having an affair with a married woman named Maria Rosa Guerra that gets revealed in a dramatic fashion on August 21st, 1744, when her husband is shot.
Yeah, this is an interesting time in San Antonio history. We have an alcalde who's in charge of the city. You have a presidio, and you have a presidio captain. And then you've got the work going on at Mission Valero, and that's where Teo comes into play. And that's being overseen by the Catholic Church. So you have kind of these 3 bodies working together in one little town. There is a man who is shot, and he's taken to a local house. The alcalde or magistrate is called over to the house. It's the home of Geronimo Flores. And inside the house, they find Matias de Trevino, and he is bleeding heavily from several wounds. And when they question what happened to him, the 48-year-old Presidio soldier, Matias Trevino, says that he's been shot. And he names his assailant, and he says it's Teo.
So he's sitting there bleeding heavily, hours from dying, and he names his shooter.
Yeah, his words were, it was that master mason who was working in the mission of San Antonio, and they wounded him in the woods.
Wow. Do we have records that detail all of this?
Yes. So the Spanish, for all their things that they've done, they were fantastic record keepers. They kept track of everything. And in the Bexar County Archives, there's an entire 33-page, almost like an affidavit, but it reads all of the people who were interviewed for this eventual murder, but the shooting of it initially, to give you times, place, and all the main players.
So hours later, Trevino dies from his wounds, and there are conflicting accounts of what led up to him being shot.
Then they go into the house, Geronimo Flores. They find Matias, obviously wounded. He dies around 4 a.m. They called in what they would consider a doctor. Today, we would consider him a priest. And the priest didn't show up, so they call in a separate person. And his name is Francisco Joseph de Rocha. And he examines the wounds, and he immediately says, this isn't good. He's got a shot through his right side, came out of his abdomen, and then went through his wrist and obliterated his wrist. He's looking him over, and they know almost immediately that he's not going to make it. And that's another reason for calling the priest, give his last rites. And so all this is quickly unfolding. And now that they've seen the wounds of the man, now they're starting to wonder who did it. And this man laying on his deathbed saying it's Teo.
So he names his assassin. They have a suspect. How do they go about looking for a motive?
They start questioning people, and they really start with Geronimo Flores. And this is what I found very interesting. In the archives, I started digging back a little bit further in the year 1844. And in February, I found that Mateus Trevino, who was shot, was actually in his home, his birthplace, which would be Nuevo Leon. He's there because he had taken care of his brother's kids. They were orphaned at a very young age. His brother dies unexpectedly and leaves these children. Well, Mateus steps up and becomes kind of their, not just an uncle, but takes care of them. And when the land they were living on was going to go to auction, he stepped up and paid the money to save the land and let the children live on it. Well, those children grew up and did very well for themselves. We know this from official documents where they make a trip to San Antonio and they surprise him and give him a bulk of the land and the water rights. So in February, he's off on this trip in Nuevo Leon, and he leaves his wife in the capable hands of Geronimo Flores. And who's living in the house? It's the stonemason, Master Teo. And they're living in the house together.
All under the same roof.
All under the same roof, because you start looking at this like, how does this love triangle get its start? Also, while this is happening, before the Master Mason even comes up, he has a house built. And not for himself, but for Trevino's wife. And so she's living in this little cabin that Teo paid for on his own dime. And so when the husband comes back from Nuevo Leon, he talks to Geronimo Flores and says, hey, we had to ask your wife to leave the house because my wife caught him and Teo doing inappropriate things in our household. And so they're basically get kicked out, and there's a falling out there and an argument that takes place between Teo and Trevino and the wife. And that's kind of where I think that sets the stage for the events that'll happen with his shooting on August 21st.
And there's allegations with his shooting and eventual murder that there was a murder plot.
Yes. So there's kind of two versions of, as they start to dig through these interviews, so like what actually happened. And one version is that Mateus says that under oath that he's been wounded by the Mason of Valero, and that he was lured into the woods in the corrals at Mission Valero to pick up a dead yearling calf that he was receiving to pay off a debt from Teo. So Teo tells him, grab the front part of the cow, I'll grab the back side of it. And they lift up, and the Master Mason, Teo, says, cow starting to slip, pick it up. And whenever he leans over, he being Trevino leans over, Teo shoots him in the back. And that's how all this starts. And then he bludgeons him with the gun and then takes off and runs.
But there's another version of the story that has the wife, Guerra, telling her husband, I'll have you killed. And then 2 days later, he's shot.
Yeah, so that apparently happens whenever Flores kicks them out of the house, and then Trevino returns from his trip from Nuevo Leon, and they have a huge argument. And Maria says, at least this is what one of the interviewed individuals said. She said that they were there when it happened. She said, very well, but I promise you that I shall soon be freed from these bothersome actions, and upon my soul, I will have you killed. And so you've got a couple things moving here, and it's up to the judge to try to figure all that out.
Do Teo and Guerra, the alleged lovers, have an alibi?
Their alibi is deny, deny, deny. And, it's interesting how the Spanish legal system works during this time. Today, you are innocent until proven guilty. Back then, it was kind of like you're guilty till you prove you're innocent, and the burden of proof usually shifted to the accused. And so what's stacking up against Teo and Guerra is that there's like 6 people saying all the same thing, including the man who'd been killed. And they're all saying that Teo shot him and that Guerra wanted it done. And so that's not a good deal. So don't think of it like today in modern times, Teo is going to end up running for his life because he has the burden of proof that he'd have to prove.
But they deny the affair, they deny the death plot, and Teo has an excuse basically saying, I confused him for an attacking Apache and I fired in self-defense.
Yeah, this doesn't hold water, because when the doctor comes in, or the doctor in quotations comes in to look at Mr. Trevino, they find powder burns on his shirt, meaning that the gun barrel must have been pressed almost against his skin when it was was fired. On top of that, the witnesses say that this takes place, including Mr. Trevino says it takes place about 5:30. I did some looking, and according to the astronomical applications of the U.S. Naval Observatory, the sun rose on Sunday the 21st at 06:05 in the morning, and the sun set at 7 o'clock at night. So Teo's going to say, I thought he was an Apache Indian in the brush, so I shot him. It wasn't even dark. And so you've got this deal where it's not even dark. It couldn't have been an Indian. And also he's got burn marks on his shirt.
Such
so
close
he was
contact.
right on top of him.
Guerra, the wife, is arrested on August 23rd, 2 days after the murder. What happens to Theo at that point?
He's going to go into the Alamo Church, which at the time would be the Lanham barrack, and he's going to call sanctuary. And basically during this period, if you run into a Catholic church and you're yelling sanctuary, it doesn't really matter what you've done, the church is likely to protect you. And due to the, as I mentioned earlier in the story, because there's kind of three governing bodies happening here, the military ultimately is going to have a lot of pull. That captain of the Presidio, and the alcalde does too, but they're going to respect the church as well. So they're not just going to go drag someone out. At least it's highly unlikely. So Teo's going to hide inside of the church, and Captain Don Urrutia is going to tell Teo, or tell his men, that he's to be brought in to be punished. So by this point, it seems like the alcalde has made up his mind that Teo is guilty. Why else would he run? They've got all these people saying he's guilty. And so they want him to be brought in. And so Urrutia has his men surround the church. They're going to try to keep Teo from fleeing.
Something that's interesting for us modern day, when we say the church, we mean the Alamo Church. But back then, that church wasn't finished. The temporary church was inside the convento, which would have been what we call the lawn barrack.
Yeah, and why this is all kind of so important to the modern Alamo story is that when Teo does all of these things, or at least the allegations come about, the church is only about hip high, maybe a little bit higher. And so he had not really got too deep into the process. And so there is no church for him to run in, at least what we see today. So you're exactly right. The lawn barrack is going to be where he's hiding. His lover, Maria, will be arrested and put in shackles by the blacksmith. So they call the town's blacksmith. They go and they put hot shackles on her, and they put her inside of a room inside of the house of the alcalde, because there was no prison in San Antonio at the time. It was under construction, but not finished.
And then Theo is barricaded inside the lawn barrack. What happens next?
Don Alberto Fuerte gains permission from the priest to enter the Valero church to get Teo. When they go inside, he's gone. He let out. The priest, kind of shrugs his shoulders. I have no idea. And so
He escaped all those guards.
he escaped all those guards and he slipped out. All they found were some clothes, which is another interesting part. When he gets inside of the church, the alcalde does go and interview him, and he denies everything, of course. But he also tells one of the Presidio soldiers, go to Maria and tell her to bring me fresh clothes. Well, why would she have control of your clothes? It's because they were living under the same roof in that house that he had built. So there's another strike against Teo. If he was innocent, there's a lot of evidence to say otherwise. The alcalde then sends out a series of letters and dispatches to other churches and presidios in case Teo tries to take refuge there. He's to be arrested and returned to San Antonio for punishment.
Is he ever seen or heard from again?
Never heard from again. I found no records of his death. Also, we have no idea what happens to Maria. They just don't say. So, I mentioned they're good record keepers, but it just kind of ends. I looked at other murders that happened in San Antonio that were a little more straightforward, where the people did not get away. And a particular one where a woman has one of the indigenous people from, I think, Mission Concepcion, murder her husband, and he confesses that she made him do it. So they have a clear line of, okay, you are guilty. And they banish both of them to Florida.
Florida?
Yeah, so they send them off to Florida. And so I don't know if that's what happened to Maria, but it's not documented as to what happened to her.
So in this Alamo love triangle, the scorned husband, dead, murdered, the wife, unknown, and then the alleged lover, off into the sunset, no idea what happened to him.
Disappears. And I also know that after he died, all of Mateus's private belongings, personal belongings, did not go to Maria. They went to his nieces and nephews.
That's probably where they should have gone.
Yeah, that's probably the right place.
So this dramatic crime unfolds. The master stonemason has left town. Where does that leave construction on the Mission San Antonio de Valero church?
So they've got to bring in some other people. But before they do that, the priests think they can finish the building on their own. So they use the footings that Teo had put in place. They start building and the church collapses on itself. If you're out at the Alamo today, you go to visit and the grassy area in front of the church,
yes,
even with the lawn barrack, that's where the front door of the church was meant to be. But when it collapses on itself, they pick up the stone and they move it back. They bring in someone who knows what they're doing. Several different master masons work on the church and they use the plans that Theo had drafted, and they finished the other missions.
And if Theo had been around long enough to finish the church, it would have been, as you said, several feet forward.
Yeah.
And then it would have looked totally different.
Yeah, I mean, it would have had 2 bell towers on it. There would have been bells hanging in those towers. It would have had a dome on it. And, that also would have changed a little bit how the Battle of the Alamo unfolds, using those bell towers efficiently, or you wouldn't have really had a cannon ramp inside of there. So there wouldn't have been an artillery emplacement inside the church.
I've heard you say this on many tours. The church got as finished as it was ever going to get in about 1751.
Yeah. So they get as far as they're ever going to get. It's not going to have its roof for almost 100 years.
So the church remains roofless down the center, what's known as the nave. How does that impact Catholic Mass during the rest of the mission period?
Yeah, anyone who's ever been to Texas in the summertime knows it's hot. And so you're not going to be having Mass in there. You're not really supposed to have Mass outside. And so they're going to use the 2 side rooms to have Mass. And that changes everything. You go from having this big, gigantic room to have Mass in to not having that space, and you won't be able to utilize it.
And when the Texas Revolution unfolds and the Alamo becomes a fort and a battle site, the roofless church really plays into the battle logistics.
Yeah, it does. Because the roof is open, the Mexican army uses that opportunity to build an artillery emplacement, and the Texans make use of that during the famous battle, and they gain control in December of 1835.
As we know, the Alamo Church eventually gets its first roof in the 1850s when the U.S. Army is using the church as a supply hub. There are so many chapters of Alamo history. As we reach the end of this chapter on the Alamo Love Triangle, what does it teach us about history?
I think for me, when I was doing all the research on this and, reading the 30 plus pages, plus another 50 or so pages on the similar case, I just started to realize that people are people. And, when we look at these time periods, don't look at them just as dates. Realize that these are real human beings. They have their own problems, and the times may change, but people don't.
In preparing for this episode, we've had people compare it to a true crime documentary. We've had people compare it to a soap opera. And the truth is, it's just history.
That's it. I think that's what makes history so unique, is that it's the study of us, people.
Kolby Lanham, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. Did you know you can take a virtual tour of the Alamo Church? We've posted a link to it so you can take a closer look at the stonework. You can even see inside rooms that are currently closed for preservation. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.